Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting Live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell.
Hello? Hello? Ladies and gentlemen, I do not know if you can hear me. I cannot hear William Bell. The intro played just fine, which indicated to me that William was on site, but I do not know if William is there. I cannot tell anything from my icons. Everything seems to be operative on my end. I simply do not know what's going on. So I'm hoping that I can be heard. I'm hoping that we can get some technology worked out here. I have no earthly idea what's going on. If someone who is listening can hear me, and if you happen to be on my contacts list for Skype, you might send me a private message very, very quickly and let me know if you can hear me. I'm almost reluctant just to start talking, not knowing whatsoever if anyone can hear me. William says, with the text on my phone now, I can be heard. Well, that's wonderful, but I cannot hear him at all, so I have no earthly idea what's going on. Well, with that said, since evidently I can be heard, what I will do is, and thank you very much, Kevin, for sending me a messenger on Facebook. I appreciate that, letting me know that I can be heard. Okay, that is great, and I'm getting some more messages here that lets me know that people can hear me. Okay, well, folks, I hope you had an absolutely fantastic holiday season. Hope you have a great, happy New Year. We appreciate you being with us so very much on Two Guys and a Bible, as William hopefully tries to get the technology worked out there. I want to thank William Bell for taking up the entire program last week. As I took my wife to the doctor, we did get absolutely fantastic news that everything was clear. They had found some nodules on her lymph nodes, and that, of course, was a very serious concern to us. But everything showed out clear. Everything showed out to where we do no treatment of any kind is expected or needed. So we're very, very thankful to the Lord for that. Well, we are going to continue this evening with an examination of the presentations that were given at the Bellview Church of Christ lectureship back in June of last year. The entire lectureship was dedicated to, quote, the refutation of realized eschatology. They had numerous speakers on their dais, each of whom claiming that covenant eschatology, i.e. preterism, realized eschatology, they many times just simply referred to us as RE folks. But they all assured everyone that we are nothing but heretics. This is false teaching, it's false doctrine, and it will lead a person directly to hell, and there's no question about it. If you have been following the critiques that William and I have been doing here on Two Guys in the Bible, and by the way, if you haven't been able to listen to them, they are archived. They are available for you to listen to at any time, and so I want you to take advantage of that. So make sure you take advantage of that as soon as, as often as you can. It's a great resource, by the way. And I have to tell you something. The response to these programs has been nothing less than absolutely fantastic. I know that there are a lot of people out there that don't even like what we're doing. Some people call it negative. But I can also tell you that the response has been absolutely wonderful from people who have told us, who have emailed us and told us, do you know what? I was listening mostly to those guys, but I felt like I needed to listen to the other side. Even though I felt like you and William were crazy, even though I felt like you preterists were crazy, and yet as a result of listening to the programs, these individuals have become convinced that covenant eschatology has more merit to it than they ever thought possible, that in fact they've come to realize that the lessons that were given down there at the Bellview Church of Christ lectureship were extremely, extremely shallow. They did not have any substance to them. And they most assuredly did not serve to refute covenant eschatology. So let me encourage you once again to take advantage of the archives and to listen to the programs and share this resource, because I can assure you, if people think that the folks at the Bellview Church of Christ lectureship had the answers, once they will begin to actually listen to the material that William and I have presented, they will very quickly discover that those gentlemen on that dais, number one, had not done their homework. Number two, they very commonly, totally misrepresented the views of covenant eschatology, and most assuredly they misrepresented the views held by William Bell and Don K. Preston. Number three, their own views of eschatology are absolutely at total variance with Scripture, has no merit whatsoever. And so let me once again encourage you to take advantage of the resource that William and I have provided you. Well, on the schedule for this evening is a presentation by a minister by the name of Johnny Oxendine. He's from California, and he is a minister that, well, his basic approach, and his lesson was on 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 to 18. And his basic approach was, if you can read, then you know that preterists are wrong. If you can read, you know that everything that they have to say is false doctrine. And I can't help but be reminded with this approach how quote, simplistic it is, how divorced it is from understanding the Hebraic mindset, how divorced it is from understanding biblical prophetic language. And let me illustrate something for our audience this evening. Johnny Oxendine, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I certainly don't want to mispronounce the name, and I certainly would not do so on purpose. But Johnny Oxendine, if he's a typical member of the Churches of Christ, the members represented at the Bellview Church of Christ lectures, and of course, as generally represented in much of the Reformed view of the postmillennial world as well. So you have the amillennial world and the postmillennial world, and both of those paradigms, what happens? They go to Matthew chapter 24, 29 to 31. And you have Jesus saying immediately after the tribulation of those days, and that's the Great Tribulation. And guess what? Both the amillennial and the postmillennial world say that the Great Tribulation occurred in the first century without any question whatsoever. James Jordan, a Reformed amillennialist, says it is perverse, that's his word, to believe that there is to be another second great tribulation. Kenneth Gentry, one of the more noted postmillennial spokesmen of the day, says there is a vast array of information and evidence to prove that the Great Tribulation occurred in the first century. He does not believe there is another Great Tribulation in the future. Same thing with Gary DeMar. Same thing with Joel McDermott. Now that's
hello, Don.
There's my friend.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but go ahead.
So anyway, we have the postmillennial world and the all-millennial world, all of whom affirm that the Great Tribulation was in the first century. They come to Matthew 24, 29 to 31, immediately after the tribulation of those days. The sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give its light, or the moon shall be darkened, the sun shall not give its light, the stars of heaven shall fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Then shall they see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and they shall see the Son of Man coming on the heavens, on the clouds of heaven, with power and great glory. Then the Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather the elect from the four winds, from one part of heaven to another. And guess what happens? The amillennial world and the postmillennial world says, oh, well, look, in order to understand this text, you have to understand the nature of prophetic language. The coming on the clouds, Jesus coming on the clouds, is metaphoric language. It's prophetic language. It's apocalyptic. It's not to be taken literally. But what do? They come to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Mr. Johnny Oxendine, and we have Jesus coming with the angels for the gathering of the elect. And guess what? He says that must be literal. Well, where's the difference? As a matter of fact, folks, as I demonstrate in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Waiting of the King of Kings, there is a perfect point-by-point comparison between Matthew 24, 29 to 31, or 34 actually, and 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 to 18. All you have to do is just make a chart on your own piece of paper and list them. Coming of the Son of Man, with the angels, with a shout, with the sound of a trumpet, for the gathering of the elect, etc. I mean, every point is the same. And Johnny Oxendine would say, well, Matthew 24, now that's obviously the return of the Lord and the judgment of Israel in AD 70. But 1 Thessalonians 4, now that's obviously the end of time event. And yet, the exact same precise point-by-point comparison is between Matthew 24 and 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And look, I can tell you story after story after story of both amillennial and postmillennial folks who had never realized that perfect comparison. When they saw the parallel charts, when they saw the perfect parallelisms between the two texts, they basically said one of two things. Number one, either this discussion is over, I'm not going to study this anymore, or number two, I've never seen that before, I'm going to have to think about it. William, am I correct in assessing the reality of that Johnny Oxendine would see Matthew 24 as AD 70, but he would see 1 Thessalonians 4 as end of time?
Well, I would think that that's a correct assessment. Maybe I missed that part. I did listen to him. I didn't hear him say very much about Matthew 24. He claimed that Paul had a private revelation on the words of Christ. So, unlike most people that I understand to correlate, as you were just saying, Matthew 24 and 1 Thessalonians 4, he suggested that it was a personal revelation, some private revelation. That was his belief. I think he might have acknowledged, now that I think about it, that other people did see it that way. But anyway, that's what I was able to pick up during his speech.
Well, you're exactly right. He did say that 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is a private revelation, which, of course, means that it cannot be, in his thinking, if I understood him correctly, he would want to delineate between 1 Thessalonians 4 and Matthew chapter 24. Now, a lot of our brethren try to do that. That is to be sure. Now, here's the interesting thing. These guys like to tell us that Paul agreed with Jesus. Well, obviously he did. Okay? They also like to sometimes quote the scholars. Okay? That's fine. Well, if they quote the scholars, then most scholarship agrees that in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul is drawing directly from Matthew chapter 24, 29 and following. As a matter of fact, it's interesting to me, Greg Beale, in his commentary, in his comments on 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, he's very, very clear that Paul is drawing directly from the Olivet Discourse in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. So it's so interesting, so fascinating to see how these brethren, maybe Johnny Oxidine had seen the train coming, William. Maybe he realized that if he said, oh, yeah, Paul got his doctrine of eschatology from Jesus, well, okay, then the obvious place for him to have gotten it was Matthew 24, which he takes as AD 70.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's rather interesting that all the elements, as you pointed out, every constituent element of Matthew 24 in the Olivet Discourse is found in 1 Thessalonians and vice versa. I mean, we get back into these two trumpets and two sets of clouds and everything else, with these guys, if they're going to attempt to dispute that. So there's just no way out for them to teach 1 Thessalonians without acknowledging that. I mean, what's the difference between them? There isn't.
Exactly, and that's the point that I was going to raise. If they're going to make the claim that 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is not Matthew chapter 24, in spite of the fact that every constituent element is exact and precise, the words are the same, the themes are the same, the motifs are the same, if they're going to make that claim that in spite of those parallels and in spite of those similarities, if they're going to make the claim that 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is in fact to be taken literally and that the cloud is literal, even though we don't find an emphasis on clouds in 1 Thessalonians 4, we do have the emphasis on the air. If they're going to say that the angels in Thessalonians are literal versus, spiritual back over here in Matthew 24, if they're going to say that the trumpet is literal versus spiritual in Matthew 24, to make that assertion puts the onus, puts the responsibility firmly on them to prove that. And I had a debate with John Welch in Indianapolis back in 2008. And I never will forget, the building was absolutely packed. And of course, I also remember that I had double pneumonia during the entirety of the debate, so I was not exactly on top of my game. But point of fact is, he appealed to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. And he said, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is different because it says, the Lord himself shall descend. And he emphasized the word himself. And so I put my chart up there with the point-by-point comparison. I said, prove the difference. And when I put that chart up there, to use the term, the body language of that audience of 250 or more preachers was absolutely incredible. You could tell those men, the great majority of them, had never, ever seen that comparison before. It literally shocked them. You could see the shock visible on their faces. And so, again, the burden of proof is on Johnny Oxendine, when he says, or if he tries to say, should he say, 1 Thessalonians 4 is obviously different from Matthew 24. What makes it obviously different? It doesn't work just by making the claim, oh, well, guess what? Paul received a private revelation in Thessalonians. That doesn't prove anything. Maybe he received a private revelation from the Lord Jesus Christ, reiterating, reemphasizing, and revealing that what he was saying was from Matthew 24. These guys just make some of the wildest, most desperate claims. William, you and I have seen it in the entirety of our critiques of every speaker so far, and we have several speakers left. But we have encountered some of the most desperate type of claims with virtually no evidence given as proof. None.
Yeah.
And yet they expect their audience just to accept their word as inspired, I guess.
Well, I mean, they've been saying it over and over again. I guess, you can tell yourself something over and over again and you'll eventually believe it. And that's basically what's happened in their case. They have been told this over and over again. They tell themselves the same thing over and over again. And that just eliminates any effort. I mean, you could tell from listening to Johnny Oxendine that there was no real, and we've said this before, there was no real substantive study in it. I looked at the clock as I was listening to him, and he was well within 15 minutes of his presentation before he even came close to addressing, the essence of the text, and never really got into anything particular and specific. These little casual.
You're exactly right.
These little casual remarks like, you got to be crazy to believe something like that. That's kind of the approach that they take when they call themselves exegeting a text.
Yes, yeah, he did. He literally spent a great deal of his time in ridicule and more obfuscation than anything else, in my opinion. I found myself doing the same thing as you, sitting there going, okay, you're 10 minutes into your presentation. When are you going to deal with the text? When are you going to deal with what Paul is actually saying? And then I found it very interesting to really get into our examination of some of the things that he said, William. I took note of the fact that he started out by saying 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 10 is really the foundation of the entire epistles and everything that Paul had to say on the coming of the Lord. And I thought, wow, you don't want to go there. You really, really, really don't want to go there. And yet he emphasized that 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 10 is the foundation for everything that Paul says. It's the source. It's the fountain, if you please, from which everything else that Paul has to say about eschatology in the book is based upon. Well, okay, folks, let's take a look at this. Paul said to the Thessalonians, you know what manner of entering in we had among you, and your reception of the gospel, and obviously I'm paraphrasing here, but Paul says, you turned from idols to serve the living and the true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, and who delivers us from the wrath that is coming. Now, I want to point out a couple of things very, very quickly. Paul said that it was the Thessalonians that had turned from their dead idols to serve the living and the true God, who had raised Christ from the dead, and who was delivering them. This is in the present tense in the Greek. We have here a really great example of the already but the not yet of Scripture. You go back in Romans chapter 5, and Paul says God has delivered us from the wrath that is coming. Has, past tense, aorist tense. But now he says God is delivering us in the present tense. So is it past or is it present? The answer is yes. And, you know, William, you and I know we get in these discussions very often, and it just blows our mind how some people want to deny a transitional period. They want to deny the already but the not yet of the things that are going on in the first century from the cross until the parousia. But this is a vain objection, because Paul said in Romans chapter 5, verse 9, Christ has delivered us, past tense, from the wrath that is coming. And this same writer says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, he is delivering us from the wrath that is coming. By the way, the wrath that is coming is also in the present tense. Now, I just wanted to call very brief attention to that, but then I want to call everyone's attention to this, and I just want to throw it out there and have William pick up on it. We need to go back and take a look at the ministry of John the Baptizer. Who was John? Well, Jesus said he was Elijah, and then we can go, that's in Matthew chapter 17, but in Mark chapter 1, verse 1 to 3, we read, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, saying, prepare the way of the Lord. Behold, I send my messenger before my face. He shall prepare the way before me. Now, Mark is talking about John the Baptizer. And what does he do? He calls him the voice of Isaiah 40, and he calls him the messenger of Malachi chapter 3. William, he is the voice, he is the messenger, and he is Elijah. That is, John the Baptizer was the voice, the messenger, and Elijah. What did John predict, prophesy, and foretell, William?
Well, obviously he predicted, foretold, and prophesied of the wrath that was coming, of the judgment that was coming, of the day of the Lord that would burn like an oven, and that Elijah would come before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So all of that.
So we have John, who is the voice, and by the way, in Isaiah chapter 40, the prophecy that predicted the coming of the voice, it said the voice would prepare the way of the Lord coming in judgment. Isaiah 40, verse 10 and 11.
Right.
The voice who would come, or excuse me, the Lord who would come with his reward to reward. Okay. Number two, he is the messenger to prepare the way of the Lord, and Malachi says, who can stand before him when he comes? And the Lord said in Malachi chapter 3, verse 5 and 6, the Lord said, behold, I will come near to you in judgment, and I will be a swift witness against you, against the sorcerer, against the adulterer, against those who oppress the widow, which is a citation of Exodus 22 and Deuteronomy chapter 27. Now, what's fascinating about this is that John is the messenger to warn about this coming of the Lord, who is going to come in punishment of sorcerers, adulterers, extortioners, etc. But again, that's from Exodus and Deuteronomy. But in Exodus and Deuteronomy, the Lord said, when you do these things, what things? Extortion, you mistreat the widows, you're adulterers, idolaters, you mistreat the foreigners, etc. The Lord said, when you do that, I will bring national judgment on you. I will bring the sword of judgment on you. So here is God saying that the punishment for the things listed in Malachi chapter 3 would be national judgment at the day of the Lord that the messenger would herald. And then, as you pointed out, William, he's Elijah, who would predict the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord, the day that would burn with fire. And now we come to Matthew chapter 3, and as you well stated, John foretold the wrath to come. But, William, it's not just simply wrath to come, was it?
No, it was the wrath about to come.
All right. And not only that, he said to those Pharisees and Sadducees, who warned you to flee from that wrath about to come? William, tell me if this is a valid point. This has always struck me as rather remarkable. Did the Pharisees believe in life after death, William?
They did.
What about the Sadducees?
The Sadducees did not.
Okay. So the Sadducees didn't believe in life after death. They didn't believe in hell, therefore, did they?
No.
Okay. So if the Sadducees didn't believe in life after death, if they didn't believe in hell, why are the Sadducees coming out there to John to be baptized of John to escape the wrath that was about to come?
Well, they certainly believed the Old Testament scriptures, and they understood the wrath was all about removing them from their status in the Jewish system.
There you go. They
and
understood the wrath about to come was national judgment, in other words.
Exactly. Interestingly, in Isaiah 40, John also, Isaiah, in recording the information about John, also is a prediction of the end of heaven and earth.
Yes.
When you parallel that with 1 Peter, and I know Johnny Oxendine mentioned that, and that's a little bit down the road, but that's all in that same context.
William, this is just another example of how folks in the amillennial camp so horribly ignore the Old Testament. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to be on Steve Vase's board today on Facebook on As It Is Written, but there's a fellow on there by the name of Scott Russell. And Scott will come on for a while. He'll throw around a lot of false accusations. He will pose questions when he's answered, and then when he cannot answer, then he abandons the board for a good little while, and then he'll come back on and act as if he has always answered the questions, act as if he's got all the answers. Well,
we've seen those before.
we've seen a lot of those type of guys before, and he going all the way back to September of last year, he appealed to Hebrews chapter 1 and Psalms 102 as predictive of the end of literal physical heaven and earth. When I pointed out from the text that Psalms 102 posited the creation of a new people at the destruction of the old heaven and earth, I asked him what old people would be destroyed, what new people would be created. Well, again, this is all the way back. It started in August, went all the way through September. He never even attempted to answer. Well, just the other day, he posted back on, and he goes, what happens to the church when the sun burns out? Arguing on the second law of thermodynamics, and then appealed again to Psalms 102. And when I reminded him that he had never answered my argument, never answered my questions about what people will be destroyed at the creation of the new people, 5 times I posed the question again over the last week. 5 times he ignored it until finally he tried to answer it. I think it was this morning. But in his answer, he illustrated, demonstrated, and exemplified the amillennial ignorance of the Old Testament. They do not evidently even understand how to engage in biblical exegesis. He made some of the most off-the-wall comments about Psalms 102. He completely misrepresented the preterist view, and then denied that I had really made any points at all. And his only response to the argument that I made it was, it's wrong, you're wrong as usual. Now, boy, I got to tell you, I was just totally devastated at that. I thought about becoming a futurist again, based upon that. I mean, incredible claim, incredible logic, incredible use of proper hermeneutic. I mean, it's just, but it's so sad. Now, folks, we're saying all that to get to this, okay? Paul in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 is talking about the wrath to come, the wrath that was coming. John foretold the wrath that was about to come. All right. Now, here's a question. It would be a question for Scott Russell. It would be a question for Johnny Oxendine. It would be a question for any of our other detractors. From the time of John, when John said to the Pharisees and Sadducees, who warned you to flee from the wrath that is about to come, from that time until Paul had the wrath of God fallen on Israel in national judgment, just as Exodus 22, Deuteronomy 29 promised, that was being cited, of course, in Malachi chapter 3. Well, the answer to that is no. National judgment had not fallen on Israel from the time of John until the time of Paul. Israel had not been judged by the sword. Matter of fact, that was a pretty peaceful time overall. Paul's writing in 49 to 51, and I will certainly grant this, that in 39 to 41, there were some really horrific things that took place in Jerusalem, but not on the nation as a whole, not on Judea as a whole, not on Israel as a whole. So you can't be argued that. So here's the question, folks. John said, and remember, John is the herald of the day of the Lord, as Elijah. The day of the Lord, that would be the day of wrath, the day in which no one could stand, the day of national judgment for Israel. It had not happened from the time of John until the time of Paul. So the question is, folks, why is it the day of wrath? Why is it the wrath that was coming of Paul, not the day of wrath of John in Matthew chapter 3? And William, if it's the same day of wrath that was coming, what does that do for Johnny Oxendine's view of Thessalonians and eschatology?
Well, it just destroys it. I mean, it's like you said, if he's going to use chapter 1 and even 1 Thessalonians period, if he's going to use that, it's just going to destroy him, and it does. But that's definitely the wrath, because Paul alludes to it as well in chapter 2 and in these verses that you're citing from Isaiah 40 and from Matthew 3 and Matthew 17. All of these verses in Malachi 4, every single one of them are focused on that wrath that was about to come, that was predicted in relation to John coming in the end of that age.
And you brought it up because obviously you knew that's where I was going to go. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul said, you, brethren, the Thessalonians, have become partakers of the sufferings from your countrymen, and that by that he means their Jewish countrymen. Acts chapter 17 demonstrates that. And he said, the Judeans, the Jews, the Judeans specifically here, had killed the prophets, had killed the Lord. They were persecuting the apostles and prophets of Jesus. They were filling up the measure of their sin. They were preventing the Gentiles from hearing the gospel. And Paul says, the wrath. Well, what wrath? Well, the wrath, the wrath that he has mentioned in the entirety of his discussion of 1 Thessalonians so far is the wrath that was coming in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. Now, since you have the wrath of 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and the wrath in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, where's the delineation? In 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, it's the wrath that was coming, present tense, and you have to be able to prove definitively that it was not the wrath that John foretold. Well, the wrath that John foretold is the wrath that was coming in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. So once again, where is the delineation, the distinction between the wrath that was coming in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and the wrath that was about to come in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2? You know, it just amazes me how people overlook this connection. Matter of fact, William, as you know, I've been working on a book on John the Baptizer as Elijah for, well, a couple of years now. And I'm just absolutely fascinated by the material, by the literature, and by how pervasive John's message is in the New Testament once we are attuned to it. And yet, it's absolutely fascinating to me. And I have been looking at this a lot lately and doing my research. You just don't hardly find, now there are a few exceptions, but overall, you do not find very many commentators who make the connection between the wrath that was coming in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and the wrath that John foretold in Matthew chapter 3. So far, I'll just share this bit of information. The only commentary that I have found so far, now I've looked at probably 15, maybe 20 commentaries so far, but the only one so far that has made the connection between John and 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 is good old Adam Clark. And he doesn't specifically mention John the Baptizer in his commentary on Thessalonians, but he does say that the wrath that was coming in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 was in fact the wrath that was coming on Israel. Now, I know that Clark in Matthew chapter 3 saw John's message of the wrath that was about to come as AD 70. No question whatsoever about that. So here we have Adam Clark making the connection between the wrath that was about to come in Matthew 3 as AD 70, and we see Clark saying in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 that the wrath to come that was coming was AD 70. But again, he doesn't specifically mention John the Baptizer. Probably in his mind, he made that connection. He just did not state it in his writings. But he, to this date, as I sit here talking tonight, Adam Clark is the only commentator that I have found that makes the connection between Matthew 3, the wrath that was about to come, and 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. That is a stunning oversight. And again, the commentators are not making the connection between the message of John and the wrath about to come and 1 Thessalonians. Even though the wrath which John said was about to come had not yet happened when Paul wrote, and then even in spite of the fact that those same commentators in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, when Paul says the wrath of God has come upon them to the uttermost, guess what? They recognize that was the impending judgment on Jerusalem in AD 70. The great majority of the commentators that I've examined so far, they apply 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 to the end of time, divorcing it from chapter 2 with no exegetical justification whatsoever. Much like, our friends on Facebook, much like Mr. Oxendine, who gave us no exegesis of the text. He simply made, he made one true observation. He did say, and is correct in this, 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 is in fact the fountain from which the rest of Paul's eschatology in Thessalonians flows, and yet he said not a word, not one word about the connection between John and Paul. It's amazing, absolutely stunning to me.
Yeah, obviously so. I mean, it's as you say, it's one of those things that it's just hard to wrap your mind around how they can look at these texts, see all the similarities in the even in reading the context and examining what's before and after the actual verse, because a lot of times they're wanting to make the argument similarity of speech doesn't guarantee the what's the term, the
identicality of subject.
Yeah. And but context is a whole different story, So if you examine the context is what's going to define what's in the text. And when you see that context, it makes it very, very clear. But, because of these ideas that they have about, such things like fire, end of the world, etc., they have fixed their minds so to believe that this is beyond an application to the end time, as you were talking about, Scott Russell a few minutes ago. They just go right past it and ignore it. And all the evidence is there if they would examine it.
Yeah, I'm just, it never ceases to amaze me, but it always saddens me when I read comments that are made, when I hear men like Johnny Exegesis, and I'm sure he's a nice guy. I'm sure that if we were to sit down with coffee over him without the conflict of covenant eschatology between us, you know what, I bet he's a nice guy. I just really bet he is. And I bet a lot of these other guys, if you could get them out, if you could get them to just simply lower the rhetoric, lower the heat, and be brethren, if you could get them to just be fellow Bible believers, fellow Bible students who are trying collectively. We're all trying to find the answers. And not have that automatic, you're a heretic, you're doomed, you're going to hell, you're not a member of this and you're not a member of that. Just get all of that laid aside, then they would discover, hey, there's something here. And William, I was telling you earlier in the day about receiving an email from a gentleman, and he ordered several $100s or a couple of $100s worth of books just recently. And he said that he certainly was a futurist. He'd been a partial preterist, and he tried really, really hard to reject covenant eschatology. But he said he's finished looking at 100 of my YouTube videos, and he said, I just simply cannot fight the truth anymore. He said, I'm a full preterist. And when people, sometimes that's what it takes. Sometimes it takes people in the privacy of their own home, with their own computer, no one throwing stones at them, no one calling them names. There's no heat, there's no passion involved. Now, there certainly is tradition. There certainly is prejudice, all of which can be extremely powerful. But nonetheless, when there are no external forces at work, when the peer pressure is not there at the moment, then guess what? Then people can start listening. They can start reading on their own. They can start thinking on their own. And when they do, and look, it's perfectly natural to have objections. William, you and I both had internal objections for years. We had our own private struggles for a long time. That's not the question. The question is, do we keep asking questions? Do we keep studying? Do we keep thinking? Do we keep looking at things from the different angles and looking for the addition? Do we keep looking for the answers? Or do we say, oh, well, got an objection. Okay, that's good enough. I'm not going there anymore. And I know a lot of guys are like that, and you do too.
Yes.
If they can find what they think is sort of an answer, sort of a good objection, then guess what? That's it. Boy, they're out of there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
really
passages that, had me stumped for years. And then I'm thinking of one in particular, at least I think I got it figured out, and that was Daniel 8, But I came to what satisfied in my mind that, hey, I think I got something that makes sense. But, for years, struggled with that text. But it wasn't outside of the scope. That's the biggest thing I tell people. If you're going to study eschatology, there's a framework. And it's like working that puzzle. That's a very simple illustration. Anybody can get it. If you have a puzzle or a picture frame, whatever picture you got to cut it to fit that frame. You can't stick it on the outside of the frame. And it's the same way with the jigsaw puzzle.
That's exactly right.
You can have thousands of pieces to a jigsaw puzzle. If you put the framework together, and that framework is those time statements, that first century generation, because that's what Christ gave, the work of the Holy Spirit, which we all know consummated. And when I say all, I'm talking about all these all-millennial brethren from churches of Christ, because they understand that, even though not many of them will see it as the destruction of Jerusalem. But when you put that framework together and the fulfillment of the law, again, another stumbling block for them because they want to push that into 30 AD. But the point is, that framework exists. And if you take that puzzle piece, it doesn't matter if you know what those passages mean or not. And that was always what kept me moving in the right direction. I knew if I had a text that I didn't understand, it had to fit the framework. I just had to figure out how it fit. And that's the big thing. But they don't have a framework other than just lumping everything at the end of time, or lumping everything in what they call the end of time, because there is no such thing, or trying to lump everything in Pentecost. And it is between those two dichotomies that they have all this friction in their eschatology. And as you were saying earlier, with the lack of a transition period that blends those two together, which was the problem with C.H. Dodd and with Albert Schweitzer. And it's the consummation of that. And that was one of the greatest contributions Max King made to the movement, is being able to pull together these two tensions that these men had that created this divide in eschatology.
That's exactly right. It's a great observation. Max King did a superb job in demonstrating how Dodd and Schweitzer and men like them, they had a framework, first century temporal statements, but they did not grasp covenant. They did not grasp apocalyptic language. Pardon me. And they even dichotomized between the cross and the parousia. They failed to see that it was one eschaton, one united end of the age narrative. And it's so thrilling right now to see more and more scholars beginning to realize that the passion of Jesus was the initiation of this last days narrative. Now, personally, I like to see John the Baptizer as the initiation of the last days. That's my personal view. I think when you go to Luke chapter 1 and you examine the song about John and his role and who he was supposed to be, what he was supposed to do, and you view him in light of, as we've already indicated, of Isaiah 40, Malachi 3, and Malachi chapter 4, I don't think there's any way to avoid the truth that John was the true initiation of the last days, the consummation of the age. But nonetheless, what Max was saying was the pivotal actions of the last days was the cross. And we all agree with that by all means. So he was certainly correct in tying that eschaton period together. And, William, I'll never forget in some of our debates, our opponents, like Steve Wiggins and Bill Lockwood, just ridiculed for us seeing the unity between the cross and the parousia. And yet more and more scholars, world-renowned scholars, are beginning to see the unity of the work of Jesus Christ. It's the story of initiation and consummation. It's one story. It's one narrative. It is not two events divorced from one another by so far 2,000 years. And when people begin to grasp that, all of a sudden their entire paradigm can change. Well, William, we're almost out of time here. We've only got about 5 minutes. I want to address, in the few moments that we've got left, one of the things that Johnny Oxendine said and really emphasized, and that is, if these RE people are true, that they have absolutely no positive assurance of even an afterlife, of life after death. They have no assurance and no hope of the future. And I don't know how many of the speakers at the Bellview Church of Christ lectureship have made that accusation, but it's a bunch of them. And here again, ladies and gentlemen, there could not be a clearer demonstration, a more powerful proof that these men have not read preterist literature. To stand up in front of a crowd and say preterists cannot believe in life after death. They cannot believe that there is a future life at all. Number one, that's insulting to me, and I know it is to you. And it is such a perverse distortion of what we teach. William, where are they getting this stuff?
I'm not sure. When I think about that very argument that they made and that, Johnny Oxendine made, I'm asking myself, as many times as we have addressed that, why are they still making that same argument? Don, we go out searching for the arguments that people are making so that we can respond to them, so that we won't misrepresent them, so that we understand exactly what's being said, because we know that our position means nothing if we can't defend it honestly and truthfully, and with some integrity. And if an argument is out there, then we got to go search that down and figure out, what are they saying? Why are they saying it? Where do they get it from? And exegete that text, go into the word studies and do everything in our power to make sense of it. And then we have arguments that we have refuted over and over again. Some of them are so clearly refuted, all you have to do is quote the passage, and they still make these arguments. That, to me, is a form of arrogance that just really is insulting almost.
Well, it's a form of dishonesty because, like you say, how much effort would it take on the part of Johnny Oxendine, Howard Denham, any of the other men that have spoken on the Bellview Church of Christ lectureship, how much effort would it take for them to go and to look on some preterist websites? Now, the website that he mentioned was Preterist Archive. Right. Well, Preterist Archive is absolutely not a preterist board. So what does he do? He finds a guy who, I don't know who he's referring to, he didn't give any names, who claims to have been a preterist, but who surrendered it because there's no hope there. Well, all I can say about that individual is they did not know enough. And we see this, unfortunately, an awful lot of people who they just don't use good logic when they approach the Scriptures. I've seen people abandon covenant eschatology, pardon me, because they claim it leads to universalism. No, it doesn't. I've seen people abandon covenant eschatology and preterism because they believe that it allows people to sin because they claim there's no more sin. People just go crazy. And yet, it's interesting to me, Johnny Oxendine said, well, the preterist movement is splintering faster than we can keep count. Has Johnny Oxendine counted the number of divisions in the churches of Christ lately? And he's throwing out that accusation. He's throwing out the pejorative statement, well, there are all these divisions within the preterist movement. I would suggest that Johnny Oxendine take a look in the mirror of the Church of Christ and try to count the number of divisions that are there. There's a bunch, folks. amazing, and it's sad. Well, with that said, you know what, William? We certainly haven't covered everything he said, so Lord willing, next week we will continue our critique of Johnny Oxendine and his presentation on 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and we'll examine what little bit he actually did say about the text. In the meantime, thank you so very much for joining us for this evening's program, Two Guys and a Bible, a voice you can trust. And with that, I'm going to say good night and God bless.
All right, good night, everyone, and we thank you for being with us and look forward to being back with you on next week.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys in a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say have a very pleasant day and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.